The dull roar of the crowd was only slightly muted by the small alcove they'd been tucked into prior to the start of the match. Rather than starting at disparate duty stations, as they would be in a regular match, the team was instead all grouped together. Assumedly to replicate the idea of us landing nearby a downed airship, he thought. Glancing back, he watched as Verity finished putting on the last of her kit, as Marlene helped with some of the straps. "All good?" he asked. The orc nodded.
"Everything's as it should be, except for the..."
She trailed off as her fingers brushed over the bandolier across her chest, careful not to brush any of the orange-tipped bolts it contained.
William nodded. "I wouldn't worry about it. They're not what we practiced with, but the change shouldn't make any tangible difference on the field."
Indeed, in some ways, the wax rounds were an improvement over his original rubber design. For one thing, they'd been enchanted. According to the dour-looking palace guardswoman who'd handed them off to him and the rest of his team, the wax had been toughened so it wouldn't melt or split when fired, but would do so on impact, leaving a visible mark on the foe. Which was an improvement over his own design, which would have required the match's many observers to call out a hit if it wasn't self-evident.
Still, he thought, 50 shots overnight.
That wasn't cheap. Indeed, it equaled the entire spell-casting capacity of a mage for 17 days. Or a night's work for 17 mages. Menial mages to be certain, but mages all the same. Using spells that now wouldn't be used creating weapons, healing people, growing crops, or contributing to the nation's stockpile of enchanted munitions. There was a reason he hadn't thought of enchanted wax himself. He didn't have the time. Nor did he have the time or knowledge on how to make a conventional alternative, even if he knew such a thing existed. Not with so many other projects that required his attention. Still, he couldn't help but be reluctantly impressed by his nation's monarch, for he could think of no one else that had the kind of pull to have 50 disposable objects enchanted in a single evening. Not because of said power, but because of the decisiveness required to make that decision, and start implementing it mere minutes after hearing of his plan.
Sure be one to watch out for going forward, he thought.
Though it was only a moment later he was shaking his head, his attention turning toward the rest of his team. Thoughts of what would come after this match should be kept for after the match, lest they all become moot. Here and now, he needed to focus on here and now. With that in mind, he spared one final glance at the arena ahead, gathering what details he could from what he'd memorized of the layout, before turning back to his team.
"All right, gather up," he said, prompting the girls to gather around. "I imagine Tala thinks she's pulled a fast one on us by throwing us into an unexpected scenario, but I think we can make it work in our favor."
To that end, he pulled out a dagger and started chanting.
"Maysmith, clay, steel, fingers."
"William, what the fuck?" Alzenia shouted. "We're about to get into a fight here." And he just wasted one of his free spell slots.
"Quiet, please,"
he said, as he slowly started to move and shape the steel of the dagger with his bare fingers, the rigid material shifting under his ministrations as easily as clay. He ignored the looming start of the match. He ignored the crowds. He ignored the upset and puzzled expressions of his team. He ignored how much more upset they'd be when he burned another spell charge in a few seconds, and a third not long after. Though even as he rolled the steel in his hands into a long stick, he couldn't help one final thought that flitted across his consciousness.
"So much for getting to finally use my spellbolt," he lamented. "Still, needs must when the devil drives."
"Activate the crystal network," Tala said without preamble, as her team finished kitting up.
"For this?"
Sala, a name clearly chosen to curry favour with House Blackstone, grumbled. "Yes," she snapped, in no mood for backtalk. "For this." She intended to leave nothing to chance, not in something as important as this. Even if it was ridiculous that she was pulling out one of her team's trump cards against a bunch of first years. Normally, they avoided using the crystal network if they could. It was far from obvious, but there was always a chance of someone catching on to the idea that her team was more cohesive than they should be. And they'd wonder why and how. And if they figured that out, they'd be well on the way to replicating the feat. To that end, Tala's instructions were only to use it on important matches. Ones that would boost the prestige of House Blackstone over their political rivals, and make the politically undecided reconsider their allegiances in the brewing civil conflict to come. Tapping the side of her helmet as discreetly as she could, she felt the tiny spike of ethereal ether that jetted from her fingertip be absorbed through the grill positioned there. A low hum filled her rear as the orb next to it came to life. Once the size of a watermelon, the orb in her helmet had been painstakingly shaved down until it was barely larger than a fingernail. A move that made it useless for conveying any kind of image visually, but still perfectly sized to transmit sound. This, she thought, this is why House Blackstone will reign supreme in the end. Where elves were content to stagnate and wither with the passage of time, humans only continued to change and adapt. House Blackstone exemplified that. The shard carrier they were constructing near the capital might have been the largest and most obvious example of that philosophy, but it was simply one amongst many. Focusing her intent on her nearest teammate, she felt the connection form between their two micro-orbs. "Sherry?" she asked. "I hear you," the other girl confirmed, though her voice echoed unpleasantly, as Tala heard it both transmit from her orb and in real life, though there was a small price to pay for the ability to instantly communicate with any member of her team at will. Excellent. Though it wasn't perfect, given that she needed to manually cut the connection with her teammate before turning to the next, a move that took precious seconds, and wouldn't be possible at all if the orb she was trying to connect to was already communicating with another. The other downside was that every member of her team was now down a spell charge. Fortunately, that's less of an issue on the floats, she thought, as she connected with her other teammates one by one to confirm their orbs were functioning. The loss of an extra use of stone skin, or a flashbang, was well worth the use of near-instant communications. An advantage that would only grow in the relatively unfamiliar tangle of prefab structures and rubble that was the arena in front of them. Having turned off her orb, she turned to her team. "Elsie, you'll swing right at the start. Try to find a good firing angle, but hold back from fully engaging until I orb you to move. Maureen, you'll do the same on the left flank. Sala and Sherry will be going up the middle to try and seize that spire." She gestured to the large jutting watchtower that had been reshaped slightly to look like an airship's crow's nest, one that had fallen just slightly wonky. Reasonably well armoured, well positioned, and with a commanding view of the battlefield, it was a perfect spot from which to snipe and direct the engagement. Sure, one could achieve the same feat by simply flying up in a burst of ether, but a Marine Knight couldn't remain in the air indefinitely. And unless they remained moving, they'd be an easy target for bolt fire, while simultaneously being poorly positioned to fire back. Levitating in mid-air not being particularly conducive to forming a stable firing platform. There was a reason Marine Knights tended to perform strafing runs when firing from mid-air. The momentum of the act both acted to help evade return fire while also offsetting the recoil created by the bolt bow's firing gases. "Understood," her team said as one. And then there was no more time for talk as the start bell rang out across the arena. All five of them moved with practiced efficiency as they shot forth. Maureen and Elsie mere inches from the ground as they expertly used their thrusters to skim at breakneck speeds across the ground. For her part, Tala waited, but a half second after Sherry and Sala rocketed up into the air on a parabolic arc towards the spire. Doing so ensured the two girls would be the first to draw fire, allowing her to more effectively get a read on their enemies' positions and relay that information. Where her team's two flankers normally acted as saboteurs, and were thus equipped with medium armor, the two she was sending up the center were normally sentinels, on those occasions where the team wasn't making use of shards. To that end, the pair's plate armor was more than up to the task of deflecting any kind of incoming bolt fire at these initial ranges, and their close-range volley bows would make short work of any first years hoping to also seize the... A salvo of cracks rang out from across the arena, and Tala made out the dull thud of something striking the armoured plating of at least one of her vanguard. How peculiar. That was unlike any kind of bobo she'd ever heard. "Cadet Sala, eliminated!" rang out across the arena. What? Her mind roiled, but hundreds of hours of ingrained instinct had her orbiting Sherry, even as indignant squawks erupted from Sala's figure. "Evade!" she shouted. Ahead of her, the other girl twitched mid-flight. "Tala, they... Evade!" Tala shouted, putting her own words to action, flaring a burst of ether from her elbow and palm so that she darted to the side just as a second round of cracks rang out. 4 of them, she made sure to count. A quick glancing making out 5 distant figures, barely a step beyond their starting position. Ahead of her, Sherry had clearly heeded her words despite her confusion, dipping low in order to avoid the salvo. To the girl's right, Sala was still cursing up a confused storm, but nonetheless had her hands high over her head as she slowly floated to the ground. Zipping past her on the way toward the cover promised by the crow's nest, Tala noted a distinct orange stain splattered across the girl's plate armor. Wax! Her mind supplied near instantly, recalling the once confusing words of the match's instructor. Then she was past her dead teammate, slamming into the rim of the crow's nest with bruising force right next to her teammate. One hand gripping the rim of the nest while the other held her rifle, she struggled to maintain her grip as the weight of gravity left her dangling for just a moment, as the ether blasting from her feet and elbow that had maintained her forward momentum cut out in favor of flowing into the tank on her back. In moments, the lighter than air gas filled the tank once more, and the strain on her hand diminished as she became lighter. Though it was with long practice that she cut the flow enough to keep her buoyancy at that, just below a fraction of her actual weight, lest she end up floating up over the rim of the nest. Another salvo of crackles rang out, but it was more staggered than before, as Tala also heard the distant puff-puff of bolt bows firing. Maureen and Sherry had clearly come up slightly short of their intended flanking positions, in favour of laying down long-range suppressing fire on the relatively clumped first years. The pair would have to be incredibly lucky to score any kind of telling blow at that range, but the risk of it would force the first year's heads down and prevent them from easily moving to get a better angle on Sherry and herself. "What the fuck was that?" Sherry shouted, as the pair clambered into the crow's nest itself, careful to keep as low as possible as they surmounted the lip of the basket. "Why is Sala out?" Tala scowled as she peeked over the rim of the basket to get a better view of the unfolding firefight below. "Wax rounds," she says simply. "Apparently the first years have something that can go through plate, and they're using wax rounds to signify it." And as much as she wanted to cry bullshit on that front, she didn't doubt that if the Academy was simulating it on a match as televised as this, the capability did exist. The Crown wasn't stupid enough for it not to, not with this many people watching, and the number of stakes that were riding on this match. Of course, they'd need to prove it afterwards with some sort of demonstration, but for the moment, it could be reasonably taken on faith that this weapon existed, and the match was legitimate. To that end, this was likely some secret weapon of the Crown they presented to William to curry favour. All the better to get their claws into the man who likely had the means to kill a kraken, while simultaneously indebting them to him. Unless this new capability was William's, in that this weapon was what he'd used to kill the kraken. A human was a far cry from a kraken, but if the capability was scaled up? She shook her head. It wasn't important right now. Later, but not now. For now, she needed to operate around this new paradigm. What did she know? The weapon was loud. It outranged her own weapon. It had a reasonably slow rate of fire relative to a bolt bow, as far as she could tell. Or perhaps it had limited ammunition. Armor was useless against it, but given the limitations of its simulation, or perhaps the realities of the weapon itself, cover was still proof against it. "We need to close range while staying close to the ground," she decided. "Keep it close quarters." That would nullify the enemy range advantage, while only making her own weapons more effective. She also needed an opening to get down from the watchtower, as its shortcomings now outweighed its advantages. "Through plate? That's such..." Sherry was still shouting over the occasional crack of the new weapon and the puffing of bolt bows, but Tala cut her off. "Quiet! I need to contact Maureen and Elsie. Vent your tank and get ready to drop fast on my order." Maureen nodded as Tala's voice cut out. That was fine. She conveyed everything she needed to. Mostly not to get shot by whatever was making that cracking sound. To that end, the plan was shock and awe. The moment their leader peered over the parapet of the crow's nest and started laying down fire, both Maureen and Elsie were to advance low to the ground at speed, while contributing their own suppression. Under such circumstances, they weren't expecting to hit anything, but it would give them the best odds of closing the distance, while also giving Sherry an opportunity to drop from the crow's nest and advance herself. With 3 dangerous targets advancing from 3 different directions at once, the first year stood a decent chance of being overwhelmed with targets, and failing to focus down any of them. Assuming they were even experienced enough to recognize the inaccuracy of the incoming fire, and continue shooting rather than duck down in the face of incoming suppressive fire. A thought that sounded dismissive, but was really just sensible in Maureen's estimation. After all, it was an easy enough mistake to make in the heat of combat, and a decent part of the reason why their instructors emphasized keeping a cool head. More often than not, being able to do so was less about being able to make good decisions, and more about being calm enough to be aware of the factors involved to actually make those decisions. Instead of simply letting everything get reduced to noise and immediate threats. No, being able to observe, think, and then act was what made a decent Marine Knight. Which was why neither she nor Elsie had hesitated to deviate from their earlier orders to draw up short and lay down covering fire when Sala died. Yes, now they had to cover more ground than they might if they kept advancing, but there was every chance the match would now be a 2-on-5 rather than a 4-on-5. 3, 2, 1. On cue, she caught a glimpse of Tala popping out with bolt bow in hand before Maureen jetted out of her cover on a burst of blue-green ether. Shooting across the arena, she held down the trigger of her bolt bow in the vague direction of one of the shorter first year's positions. The girl, the dwarf, flinched back as bolts clattered against the wood around her, and Maureen grinned. A talented first year was still just a first year after all, and some instincts could only come with experience. But that smile dimmed some as a loud crack rang out, something shooting past Maureen's ear as another figure, the orc, poked her new wonder weapon out, utterly uncaring of the distant shots coming from Maureen, as most missed and the others simply clattered off her armor. Still, even as Maureen darted into a nearby bit of cover, she knew she'd accomplished her task. The first years were clumped together, and now she, and hopefully Elsie, had perfect flanking shots on the collection of debris the first years were using for cover. They'd be exposed, and Maureen was close enough for her weapon to be reliable enough at finding cheeks in armor. She slid another magazine into place before poking out, just in time to catch the dwarf trying to reposition. Only she defaulted to using her legs, rather than a few bursts of ether. Amateur mistake, the human girl thought clinically as she fired off a burst. The dwarf dropped, her wonder weapon abandoned where she'd dropped it in favour of trying to unlimber her bolt bow. A move she barely got halfway through before she'd fallen, dropped to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. Grinning, she ducked back behind cover just as another crack rang out from the orc, who had actually managed to reposition while Maureen was reloading. That was fine. Tapping her ear, she spoke. "Dwarf is down, pinned down by the orc. Any help?" God, the crystal network kicked ass. "I see her. Don't have a good shot from here. Sherry and Elsie will keep the others covered. I'll be descending to help post-haste. We'll finish her and then roll up the rest of the team." Tala smiled as she touched down into cover, behind where she'd last seen the orc. Oh, the first years had tried to shoot at her as she descended from the crow's nest, but Elsie's continued encroachment on their flank had forced the first years to switch targets lest the other girl get an easy shot on them. Such was the advantage of the crystal network. Tala had been able to time her descent just as Elsie and Sherry started to move. Indeed, things were going well after the upset in the opening moments of the match. For one thing, it seemed she'd been right about the first year's new wonder weapon having limited uses. From Sherry's last report, 2 of the 3 she could see trying to hold off her and her 2 teammates were down to using their bolt bows. Being attacked from 2 angles, the 3 remaining first years were perfectly pinned in place, giving her ample time to hunt down the one member who managed to break out of the encirclement. Truth be told, she couldn't even fault William for his approach to the match. Faced with the tangled maze that was the arena, and up against a team with more experience than his own, it made some sense to hunker down and force them to come to him by making use of his new weapons. The alternative was venturing out to be split up, cut off, and destroyed piecemeal. At least by sticking to his starting location, he could keep track of his people and use the back wall of the arena to protect his rear. And it might have worked if it weren't for his opening salvo failing to down more than one of her people, and the crystal network allowing Tala to coordinate her people, even as they attacked from multiple angles. Admittedly, she'd have been capable of the latter even without the crystal network, if she'd used Academy hand signals from her position in the crow's nest, but that would have both kept her there and allowed her opponent to read her intentions as she conveyed them. Certainly, Sherry wouldn't have been able to make her initial descent if William had the time to command his people to focus her down, even with Elsie and Maureen moving up the flanks. Tapping her rear, she came to a stop as she caught sight of Maureen, flitting between cover a few meters ahead. Theoretically, that meant the Dark Elf was somewhere between them. "Eyes on?" she asked, ducking back as a few shots from the first years near the entrance struck the cover around her. "Ahead of me. See that upturned shard wing?" She did, though there were a few obstacles keeping her from seeing the base of it. "Her back should be right to you. I think she saw you coming down, but I've got her pinned. Alright, she's probably watching for me, so we'll move together on 3. I'll poke out just enough to flashbang her, and you move up to finish her while she's mindlessly spraying in my direction." Though it was tempting to float up and over the obstacles between them to get a shot, the last attempt proved that ran the risk of her being shot by the rest of the first years, who were still exchanging fire with the rest of her team. Indeed, those shots were likely an attempt to keep her off their teammate, who would be utterly ignorant of her approaching death. As she got ready to move, she couldn't but think that it was a shame the first years didn't have a crystal network of their... A crack rang out, and Tala flitted back just as she was about to turn the corner. The timing of it couldn't have been worse though, as Maureen had started to dash forward. "Wait, more..." Her words were cut off by a loud boom, and as Tala turned around the corner, she watched her teammate be blasted off her feet by... some kind of multi-barrel volley bow variant. One that made use of the first year's new armor-piercing technology. Wax or not, the thing had enough power to visibly blow Tala's teammate off her feet, in a deluge of orange wax. Tala didn't wait to hear the girl's death proclamation before she started to bring her own bow up. But the orc was already moving, as if she'd been expecting Tala just as she'd clearly been expecting Maureen. The ingrate had the audacity to throw her weapon at Tala, bolts pinging off it as it acted as a moving barrier between the greenskin and Tala's shots, right up until it smacked straight into the human's chest. And it was not soft. Still, Tala was hardly a small girl herself or clad in armor, and shrugged it off to keep firing at the advancing orc. Instead of dodging, the savage ran straight at her like a ball, shots bouncing off her heavy armor. Seconds felt like a lifetime as Tala emptied half a clip into the massive beast, blasting ether from her feet to backpedal as she did. "Oh no you don't," the thing grunted, as she grabbed Tala's ankle, grip like iron as she used it as a fulcrum to bodily slam the Blackstone heir into the floor. "Ugh!" Tala grunted, stars dancing across her vision as her helmeted head smashed into the concrete. The air was driven from her lungs and she could only blink blearily as the monster lifted her once more, only to slam her down again, the human's ether tank making her light enough for the beast to physically swing around. Blearily, the human tried to use a burst of ether to escape or do something, but the orc's grip would not relent. Fortunately, that did at least strain her ether tank enough that she quickly became heavy enough that the orc could no longer fling her around one-handed. Though not before she was slammed into the ground with bruising force, a few times more. With that in mind, it was hardly much of a surprise at all when she found herself able to do little more than lie there and wheeze, as her badly bruised body protested the last few seconds. "There, that's... oh shit, you aren't dead, are you?" she vaguely heard the orc say. "I, didn't mean to hurt you." Tala didn't respond. She wasn't dead, in either sense of the word. The floats had specific rules around people being eliminated, and beating someone into submission was not counted amongst them, even if it would have worked practically. Cadet Marlene eliminated. Oh fuck, really? The orc said, momentarily distracted as she stood up. How? Which was all Tala needed as she rolled over. Because beaten or not, it'd be a cold day in the void when that was enough to make a Blackstone drop her weapon.